4:15 in the morning on the 24th of February, 2026. The Narva Bridge, spanning the frozen river between the Russian Federation and the Republic of Estonia. A column of T-90M Breakthrough tanks rumbled across the concrete span, their heavy tracks grinding into the asphalt of a North Atlantic Treaty Organization member state for the first time in history. The Estonian border guards at the Narva checkpoint watched their thermal monitors in a state of paralyzed disbelief as the steel tide ignored every stop signal, every radio challenge, and every international protocol that had held the peace of Europe together for 8 decades. The morning air was bitterly cold, carrying the sharp, chemical sting of diesel exhaust and the low, chest-thumping vibration of 1,000 idling engines waiting on the eastern bank. Behind the advancing armor, the horizon was not brightening with the natural light of the sun, but with the terrifying, flickering orange glow of 100-grad rocket launchers saturating the tree line. This was the moment that decades of diplomacy had failed to prevent. A collision of two worlds that had spent years staring across a narrow border while their leaders spoke of red lines and strategic depth. The decision to cross had been made in the quiet, windowless rooms of the Kremlin weeks prior, hidden beneath the guise of a massive snap exercise that had slowly massed 300,000 troops along the Baltic frontier. For the Russian Federation, this was an existential reclamation of a lost sphere of influence, driven by a deep-seated grievance and the calculated belief that the West would not risk a nuclear apocalypse for a sliver of Baltic coastline. To the soldiers inside the lead tanks, the world had shrunk to the green glow of their targeting optics and the mechanical rhythm of the advance as they moved forward into a landscape that was about to be reshaped by fire. 30 miles to the west, at Amari Air Base, the peace of the Estonian countryside was shattered by the piercing scream of twin Pratt & Whitney engines as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization's Quick Reaction Force scrambled into the darkness. 2 American F-35 Lightning fighters, part of the rotational Baltic air policing mission, taxied toward the runway, with a sense of urgency that transcended any training drill they had ever performed. The pilots, breathing heavily into their oxygen masks, were receiving data bursts that showed the border had not just been grazed, but entirely erased by a coordinated multi-axis invasion. They were the tip of the spear, the thin line of high-technology steel meant to buy time for a continent that was still largely asleep, oblivious to the fact that the post-Cold War era had ended in a single heartbeat. The geopolitical architecture of Europe, built on the foundations of collective defense and the promise that an attack on one was an attack on all, was now under its ultimate stress test. The United States and its allies had long maintained a tripwire force in the region, small, highly capable battle groups from the United Kingdom, France, and Germany, meant to serve as a guarantee of intervention. But as the Russian column pushed past the border city of Narva and into the dense forests of the east, the terrifying reality of the Suwalki Gap became the primary focus of every military planner from Brussels to Washington. This narrow corridor of land along the Polish-Lithuanian border was the only land link between the Baltic states and their European allies. If the Russian forces could close this 60-mile throat, the defenders in Estonia would be isolated, trapped between the sea and a superpower. In the command bunkers beneath Tallinn and Mons, the maps were already bleeding red as cyber attacks began to blink out the civilian power grid, plunging entire cities into a sudden, ominous darkness. This was a war of the 21st century, where the first shots were fired in the digital ether before the first physical shells hit the ground. And yet the sight of the T-90M tanks remained a hauntingly primitive reminder of the nature of conquest. The Estonian defense forces, outnumbered 10-1 in heavy armor, began to fall back toward pre-prepared positions, their commanders knowing that every kilometer they yielded was a kilometer they might never see again. They were not fighting for a tactical advantage. They were fighting for the survival of their national identity against a machine that did not recognize their right to exist. As the first hour of the invasion drew to a close, the psychological weight of the event began to settle over the combatants like a thick, suffocating fog. There was a profound sense of the inevitable, a feeling that the clock of history had been wound up by forces far beyond the control of the men on the ground, and was now simply playing out its violent mechanism. The soldiers of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the Russian Federation were no longer individuals. They were the kinetic expressions of two different visions of the future, destined to grind against one another until one was reduced to scrap and ash. The silence of the Estonian winter had been replaced by the roar of the machine, and as the F-35 fighters climbed into the high, cold atmosphere, the world held its breath, waiting to see if the fire would be contained or if it would consume everything. The architecture of the invasion was not built in a week, but in a decade of resentment and the slow, grinding erosion of the international order that had once promised a permanent end to European bloodshed. General Viktor Volkov stood in the subterranean silence of the National Defense Management Center in Moscow, his eyes fixed on the flickering blue icons representing the 41st Combined Arms Army as they pushed toward the Narva River. Outside, the winter wind howled across Red Square, carrying the faint, metallic scent of cold stone and the heavy silence of a city that did not yet know its sons were already dying in the Estonian mud. Volkov felt the immense weight of the decision, a choice made in a windowless room, where the word war was never spoken, replaced instead by the clinical language of strategic correction and historical necessity. The geopolitical context of this collision was a tangled web of broken treaties and perceived betrayals that stretched back to the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. For the leadership in the Kremlin, the steady eastward march of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was not a defensive alignment, but a tightening noose, intended to strangle the Russian Federation's status as a global superpower. They saw the inclusion of the Baltic states as a dagger held against the throat of St. Petersburg, a geographic insult that could only be answered by a show of overwhelming, kinetic force. The strategy was rooted in the belief that the West was a hollow shell, distracted by internal politics and unwilling to sacrifice the comforts of Berlin or Paris for the sake of a few miles of Estonian forest. As the physical tanks crossed the border, a different kind of violence was already tearing through the fabric of Estonian society, delivered not by shells, but by a coordinated barrage of malicious code. The national power grid flickered and died, plunging the capital city of Tallinn into a frozen darkness that felt more like the Middle Ages than the 21st century. Digital bank accounts vanished, cellular networks collapsed into static, and the once vibrant heart of Europe's most digitized nation was reduced to a collection of isolated, terrified individuals huddled around battery-powered radios. This was the opening movement of the Gerasimov Doctrine, a symphony of chaos designed to paralyze the mind of the enemy before the steel arrived to crush the body. The tactics employed by the Russian vanguard were a brutal evolution of 20th century deep battle theory, emphasizing speed and the total saturation of the battlespace with electronic interference. 3,000 paratroopers of the 76th Guards Air Assault Division had already dropped into the marshes south of Peipus Lake, their mission to seize key intersections and prevent the Estonian Defense Forces from forming a coherent line of resistance. They moved through the knee-deep snow like ghosts, the only sound the rhythmic crunch of their boots and the heavy, ragged breathing of men who knew they were deep behind enemy lines without a hope of immediate extraction. Above them, the sky was a chaotic tapestry of red tracer fire and the white-hot flares of Sukhoi 35 jets hunting for the F-35 fighters that NATO had scrambled in the first minutes of the conflict. The consequences of this tactical aggression were immediate and catastrophic for the civilian population. Caught in the path of the 41st Army's advance, tens of thousands of refugees began to clog the narrow roads leading west, their cars abandoned as fuel ran dry. And the sound of artillery grew from a distant rumble to a deafening, constant roar. Mothers clutched children against the biting wind, their faces masked by a layer of gray soot and the hollow, thousand-yard stare of those who have lost everything in a single morning. The smell of burning rubber and wet wool hung heavy in the air, a sensory reminder that the grand theories of geopolitics always ended in the intimate, personal tragedy of the displaced and the dead. In Brussels, the halls of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization headquarters were filled with the frantic energy of a house on fire, as ambassadors from 32 nations argued over the activation of Article 5. The air in the conference rooms was stale, smelling of cold coffee and the ozone of overworked computer servers, as the maps on the wall showed the red tide moving closer to the heart of Europe. There was a palpable sense of disbelief, a collective shock, that the long-predicted nightmare had finally arrived, and that the peace dividend of the last 30 years had been a mirage. Some leaders spoke of restraint and the need for a diplomatic off-ramp, while others, primarily from the East, demanded an immediate and overwhelming military response to prevent the total annexation of the Baltic coast. The psychology of the room was a microcosm of the war itself, a conflict between the desire for safety and the absolute necessity of honor, played out by men who were terrified of the nuclear shadow. They knew that every decision made in these sterilized rooms would result in the deaths of thousands of young men and women who were currently shivering in foxholes from the Ardennes to the Vistula. The weight of history was a physical pressure, a tightening in the chest that made every word feel like a monumental risk, as the ghost of 1914 seemed to walk the corridors once again. Each diplomat looked into the eyes of their peers and saw the same unspoken question. Would they be the ones to preside over the end of the world, or would they find the strength to stop the machine before it reached the point of no return? This was not merely a battle for territory, but a struggle for the soul of the international order. A test of whether the principles of sovereignty and law could survive the raw application of hard power. The architecture of ruin was now complete, the blueprint of the invasion fully realized in the smoking ruins of border towns and the silent, dark cities of the Baltic North. As the second hour of the war gave way to the third, the realization began to dawn on both sides that there would be no easy victory, no swift resolution that would allow them to return to the world as it was. The fire had been lit, and it would now burn until there was nothing left to consume, leaving behind only the cold, indifferent silence of the Estonian winter. 5:45 in the morning. The Tapa military base and the rolling pine forests of eastern Estonia. The British Army's King's Royal Hussars, manning 44 Challenger 2 main battle tanks, sat in a state of motionless, frozen vigilance as the first reports of the border breach crackled through their secure digital headsets. They were the tripwire, a force designed not to win a continental war on their own, but to die in a way that would make it impossible for the rest of the world to look away from the unfolding catastrophe. The Estonian air was a thick, gray soup of freezing drizzle and the heavy scent of damp pine needles, now increasingly punctuated by the distant, rhythmic thud of heavy Russian artillery that seemed to vibrate through the very soles of their boots. Beside the British armor, the Estonian 2nd Infantry Brigade, mostly reservists called up in the frantic, hollow hours of the night, clutched their rifles with gloved hands that would not stop shaking from the combined effects of the cold and the sheer, adrenaline-soaked terror of the unknown. The geopolitical weight of their position was a crushing burden, for they were the physical manifestation of a promise that was now being tested by the raw application of high-explosive power. For years, the presence of this small, multinational force had been a symbol of North Atlantic Treaty Organization unity, a political shield meant to deter the Kremlin. A political shield meant to deter the Kremlin from even considering a move toward the Baltic coast. But as the thermal optics of the Challenger, 2 tanks picked up the white-hot blooming signatures of Russian BMP, 3 infantry fighting vehicles emerging from the mist, the symbol vanished, replaced by the grim, mechanical reality of survival. The British and Estonian soldiers knew they were standing in the path of a tidal wave, a mass of steel and fire that had been building for decades, driven by a historical grievance that no amount of diplomacy could ever truly satisfy. Tactically, the Estonian Shield was a doctrine of calculated attrition, a desperate attempt to trade geography for time, while the rest of the alliance struggled to wake its sleeping giants. The plan was not to hold the border at Narva, a task that would have been a suicide mission, but to lure the Russian vanguard into the dense, marshy forests where the numerical advantage of the invader could be neutralized by the terrain. Every bridge on the E20 highway had been wired with plastic explosives. Every narrow forest track was pre-registered for a coordinated artillery strike, and every clearing was a potential killing zone where the cost of progress would be measured in charred metal and broken lives. The Estonian reservists, many of whom had been school teachers or IT professionals only 48 hours prior, now found themselves as the primary architects of this ruinous delay. The environment of the Tapa forest was a sensory assault of mud, iron, and the pervasive, metallic smell of gun oil and diesel fuel that seemed to stick to everything. The sound of the wind through the pines was often mistaken for the whistle of incoming shells, a psychological trick that kept every man in a state of perpetual, exhausting tension. The British tank crews, veterans of the long, dry campaigns in the Middle East, found the European theater to be a hauntingly familiar landscape from the history books, a place of deep shadows, freezing bogs, and the constant, suffocating fear of being outflanked in the dark. They moved their tanks with a practiced, funereal slow motion, the massive turrets traversing with a mechanical whine that sounded like a scream in the heavy, damp silence between the artillery bursts. As the first kinetic contact occurred, a single Javelin anti-tank missile screaming from a hidden tree line to find the vulnerable roof armor of a Russian T-90M. The philosophical gravity of the war settled over the battle group like a cold shroud. The tripwire had finally snapped, and the men of the King's Royal Hussars understood that their purpose was no longer to prevent a war, but to serve as the first few grains of sand in a machine that was already threatening to grind the international order into dust. There was no glory in the initial exchange, only the sudden, violent erasure of a vehicle and its crew, followed by a deafening silence that felt more terrifying than the explosion itself. This was the start of the long night of the Baltics, a period where the individual would be swallowed by the collective horror of a superpower collision. The consequences of this stand were already visible in the plumes of black smoke rising from the horizon and the terrified, wide-eyed stares of the refugees, who had been caught in the crossfire. This was the war that everyone had feared, but no one had truly believed would come. A conflict where the lines between combatant and civilian were blurred by the sheer scale of the devastation. The British and Estonian defenders were not just fighting for territory, they were fighting for the idea that a small nation had a right to exist without the permission of its larger neighbor. As the Russian 41st Combined Arms Army began its main assault on the Tapa line, the defenders prepared to pay the price of that idea in the only currency the invader understood. 6:30 in the morning, Ramstein Air Base in Germany, and the frozen, rain-slicked tarmac of Aviano Air Base in northern Italy. The massive, slumbering machinery of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, so often dismissed by critics as a relic of a bygone century or a casualty of bureaucratic lethargy, began to shudder into motion with a terrifying and mechanical precision. Across the European continent, from the fjords of Norway to the sun-bleached runways of Spain, the order for Vanguard Rapid Reaction had been transmitted through encrypted fiber optic lines, triggering a mobilization of men and materiel, the likes of which had not been seen since the height of the Cold War. The air at Ramstein was a thick, suffocating fog of burnt jet fuel, and the thunderous, rib-cracking roar of four-engine C-17 Globemaster transport planes taking flight every 90 seconds. Their cavernous holds filled with 2,000 paratroopers of the 173rd Airborne Brigade and the heavy equipment of a continent suddenly on a war footing. The geopolitical weight of this moment was a physical pressure that seemed to squeeze the breath from the lungs of the commanders, watching the digital status boards in the Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe. They were no longer participating in a tabletop exercise or a simulated crisis. The iron dice of history had been rolled, and the resulting movement of 300 combat aircraft toward the Polish-Estonian border was a gamble of such magnitude that it threatened to collapse the global order. For the pilots of the F-35 Lightning fighters and the FA-18 Super Hornets now screaming across the Baltic Sea, the mission was a desperate race against time to establish a bubble of air superiority over the embattled defenders in the east. They flew in a state of hypervigilance, their cockpit displays a chaotic swarm of electronic signatures as they hunted for Russian S-400 missile batteries that were already painting the sky with invisible, lethal energy. Tactically, the scramble was a logistical masterpiece, executed under the most extreme psychological duress imaginable, as every mile of progress toward the front was shadowed by the unspoken threat of nuclear escalation. The Supreme Allied Commander Europe sat in a silent, climate-controlled bunker, his eyes tracking the blue icons of 3 KC-46 Pegasus tankers orbiting over central Poland, knowing that if a single Russian interceptor crossed into Polish airspace to challenge them, the conflict would spiral beyond the reach of conventional containment. This was the ladder of escalation, a theoretical construct that had suddenly become a terrifying, vertical reality, where every tactical gain on the ground moved the world one step closer to the ultimate catastrophe. The pilots, many of whom were barely in their 20s, were being asked to navigate this threshold with only their training and the hollow, metallic taste of fear in their mouths to guide them. The environment of the mobilization was a sensory overload of gray steel, flickering monitors, and the pervasive, metallic smell of high-pressure hydraulic fluid and sweat-soaked flight suits. At the staging areas in eastern Poland, the ground shuddered beneath the weight of hundreds of M1A2 Abrams tanks being offloaded from rail cars, their desert tan camouflage a jarring, mismatched contrast to the deep green and gray of the European winter. The sounds of the bases were no longer the orderly rhythms of peacetime maintenance, but a frantic, discordant symphony of pneumatic wrenches, shouting officers, and the low-frequency thrum of auxiliary power units that never seemed to stop. Every man and woman involved in the scramble felt the same chilling realization that they were no longer living in the world they had occupied just 12 hours prior. They were now residents of a battlefield that spanned an entire hemisphere. The consequences of this rapid deployment were already being felt in the halls of power across the globe, as the sheer scale of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization's response signaled to the Kremlin that the Baltic tripwire would not be allowed to snap without a catastrophic price. This was a war of perceptions as much as it was a war of kinetic fire, where the sight of 1,000 paratroopers boarding their transports was intended to force a pause in the Russian advance by demonstrating an unbreakable collective will. Yet, beneath the professional veneer of the military response lay a deep, philosophical dread, a recognition that once the machinery of a superpower war is set in motion, it possesses a momentum of its own that no single leader can truly control. The scramble was the awakening of a giant. But as the giant stood up, it threatened to crush everything beneath its feet, regardless of the intentions of those who had built it. In the high, cold atmosphere, over the Baltic Sea, a flight of 4 F-35 fighters crossed the invisible line where the air of the West met the air of the East. Where the air of the West met the air of the East, their sensors reaching out into the darkness to find the first wave of Russian bombers. The pilots did not speak. The radio silence was a heavy physical presence in the cockpits, broken only by the rhythmic, artificial breathing of their life support systems. They were the vanguard of a civilization that had forgotten how to fight a total war, now relearning the lesson in the most brutal way possible as they prepared to engage an enemy that had been dreaming of this moment for 30 years. As the first sunbeams of the morning finally broke through the clouds, reflecting off the jagged, gray wings of the fighters, the scramble reached its crescendo, and the world waited in a state of suspended, agonizing terror for the first exchange of fire in the sky. 7:15 in the morning. The edge of the Sinimäed Hills, overlooking the primary highway to Tallinn. The 1st Battalion of the Estonian Scout Regiment, supported by a troop of British Challenger 2 tanks, held their breath in the biting, sub-zero air as the horizon finally dissolved into a nightmare of kinetic energy. For hours, the sound of the invasion had been a distant, rhythmic thumping, but now the reality was a physical presence that shook the pine needles from the trees and vibrated through the steel hulls of the waiting armor. The environment was a study in gray and white, a landscape of frozen mud and skeletal birch trees, now suddenly illuminated by the sickly green glow of night vision optics and the flickering orange-red pulses of distant rocket impacts. The smell was no longer that of the forest, but the acrid, choking stench of burning plastic, wet wool, and the sulfurous bite of spent propellant that seemed to coat the inside of every throat. Tactically, Contact Alpha was the moment the theoretical war of the war rooms became a visceral, bloody reality for the men on the ground. The Russian vanguard, consisting of the 4th Guards Tank Division, was not probing for a weakness. They were driving with the momentum of a sledgehammer, confident that their numerical superiority would shatter any resistance before it could coalesce. The Estonian infantry, dug into the frozen earth with a desperation born of ancestral memory, clutched their Swedish-made AK-4 rifles and NLAW anti-tank launchers, knowing that the tripwire had not just snapped, but was being ground into the dirt. There was no room for maneuvers or subtle flanking. This was a collision of two eras of military thought, a brutal test of whether high-technology precision could survive the raw, overwhelming mass of a superpower's industrial-scale violence. The gunner in the lead British Challenger 2 tank, a 24-year-old sergeant from Leeds, squeezed the firing trigger. The 120mm rifled gun roared with a violence that kicked the 62-ton tank backward into the soft mud, a white-hot tongue of flame lashing out 3 meters from the muzzle. The physical shockwave was a solid wall of pressure that flattened the surrounding snow and sent a cloud of frozen debris flying into the faces of the nearby infantry. Inside the turret, the sound was not a bang, but a catastrophic, metallic crack that seemed to compress the air in the crew's lungs, followed instantly by the mechanical whine of the automatic loader cycling the next round. The heat blast from the breach washed across the commander's face, carrying the sharp, iron scent of scorched metal and the dry heat of an oven. 2,000 meters away, the depleted uranium shell punched through the frontal armor of a Russian T-90M tank with the ease of a needle through silk. The impact did not cause a slow burn, but an instantaneous, catastrophic failure of the Russian vehicle's internal systems. The kinetic energy of the round converted the interior of the T-90 into a furnace of liquid steel and white-hot fragments, detonating the carousel of 42 high-explosive shells stored beneath the turret. The 6-ton turret was torn from the hull, rising 5 meters into the air, on a pillar of oily black fire before crashing back down into a thicket of frozen birch trees, crushing 2 Russian infantrymen who had been using the tank for cover. The hull of the T-90 remained in motion for 3 more seconds, a blackened, headless ghost of steel, before it veered off the road and rolled into a ditch, belching a column of thick, greasy smoke that blotted out the sunrise. The Russian formation did not falter. They reacted with a disciplined, mechanical ferocity that spoke of years of preparation for this exact engagement. 3 BMP, 3 infantry fighting vehicles, immediately swerved off the road, their 30mm autocannons erupting in a rhythmic, terrifying bark that sent a hail of high-explosive rounds screaming into the British tree line. The tracers were a series of red lines stitched across the gray sky, shredding the pine branches and turning the Estonian foxholes into a lethal spray of wood splinters and frozen earth. From the rear of the Russian column, a battery of Kornet anti-tank missiles was launched, the projectiles corkscrewing through the air, with a high-pitched, electronic whistle that signaled a desperate, lethal intent. One missile slammed into a nearby Estonian transport vehicle, the explosion sending a shower of burning aluminum and equipment 50 feet into the air as the surviving soldiers scrambled for cover in the blinding smoke. The immediate aftermath of the exchange was a landscape transformed into a charnel house of fire and iron. The silence of the Estonian morning was gone, replaced by the overlapping screams of the wounded, the roar of burning fuel, and the constant deafening thunder of secondary explosions as the T-90's ammunition continued to cook off. Black smoke hung heavy over the highway, a thick curtain that reduced visibility to 20 meters and turned the battlefield into a claustrophobic, hellish theater of shadows. The British and Estonian defenders had drawn first blood, but as the silhouettes of 20 more Russian tanks emerged from the smoke, they realized that Contact Alpha was merely the opening note of a symphony of destruction that would not end until the land itself was exhausted. The philosophical weight of the encounter began to settle as the crews reloaded, their hands slick with sweat despite the freezing temperatures. This was no longer a border dispute or a strategic correction. It was a war of annihilation, where the individual was nothing more than a temporary occupant of a machine designed to kill. The realization that they had just participated in the start of a global catastrophe was a cold, hollow feeling in the pit of their stomachs, more chilling than the winter wind. They had looked into the eyes of the machine, and they had seen that it had no intention of stopping until every green field was turned to ash and every city to a graveyard of concrete and steel. 8:30 in the morning. The Gotland Deep, midway between the Swedish coast and the territorial waters of Latvia. The German Navy frigate Sachsen, a Type 124 air defense vessel, cut through the churning gray swells with a predatory, silent grace. The crew was not practicing a routine drill. They were hunting a shadow that had already claimed 2 Estonian merchant vessels since the midnight hour. Whether the shallow, brackish Baltic would become their sanctuary or their tomb was a question that hung over the bridge like a physical weight. The water was a dark iron mirror reflecting a sky heavy with the weight of unfallen snow, and the air carried the sharp, biting scent of the sea and the faint, chemical ghost of burnt fuel from the distant horizon. The Baltic Sea had long been described by military planners as a NATO lake. But this was a geopolitical delusion that ignored the terrifying lethality of the Russian Federation's Baltic Fleet based in Kaliningrad. For decades, the shallow waters had been a chessboard of silent maneuvers. But the invasion of Estonia had transformed this congested maritime corridor into a claustrophobic graveyard. Tactically, the struggle for the Baltic was a nightmare of acoustic shadows and historical wreckage. The average depth of the sea was only 55 meters, a depth so shallow that it made traditional sonar hunting nearly impossible against a modern diesel-electric submarine. The Russian Kilo-class submarine, the Veliki Novgorod, was currently sitting on the sandy seabed, its engines completely powered down, its hull coated in anechoic tiles that absorbed the Saxon's active sonar pings like a sponge. In this environment, the high-technology sensors of a billion-dollar frigate were often less effective than the raw intuition of a sonar operator listening to the static of 1,000 shipwrecks and the grinding of tectonic plates. The Saxon's Combat Information Center was a world of hushed voices and the rhythmic, artificial chirping of underwater sensors. The commanding officer watched the waterfall display on the sonar screen, knowing that the first side to blink would be the first to die. The tension was a living thing, a tightening in the shoulders of every sailor on board, as they waited for the one acoustic anomaly that would give the Russian commander away. It was a game of cat and mouse played in a dark room filled with razor blades, where the distance between life and death was measured in the milliseconds. It took for a torpedo to acquire its target. The silence was shattered when the sonar operator shouted a contact report. The Veliki Novgorod had fired first, the high-pitched whine of a 533mm torpedo turbine screaming through the water. The Saxon's captain did not hesitate. He authorized a snapshot response to save his ship. The Mark 54 lightweight torpedo shot from the side launcher with a violent, compressed air hiss, the white-hot propellant igniting as it hit the water. The projectile dove into the freezing depths, its own active sonar head clicking like a mechanical predator as it searched for the steel skin of the Kilo-class submarine. The sound of the launch echoed through the frigate's hull, a metallic thud that vibrated through the deck plates and into the bones of the crew. The Mark 54 torpedo found its mark 2,000 yards to the southeast. The warhead punched through the double hull construction of the Veliki Novgorod, the 90 pounds of high explosive detonating with a muffled, earth-shaking crump that sent a massive plume of white water and silt erupting into the gray Baltic sky. The explosion tore a jagged, 4-meter hole in the submarine's pressure hull, the freezing sea rushing into the forward battery compartment with the force of a hydraulic hammer. The Russian vessel did not have time to blow its ballast tanks. The internal air pressure was crushed by the weight of the water, and the submarine pitched forward, its stern rising out of the waves. For 3 seconds, before it began its final, vertical descent into the Gotland Deep, the Saxon's crew watched in a stunned, heavy silence. As a massive slick of black diesel fuel and debris began to rise to the surface, floating pieces of cork insulation, a single orange life vest, and a shattered wooden clipboard were all that remained of the 60 men who had occupied the submarine. The immediate aftermath was not a celebration, but a cold realization of the cost of this maritime blockade. The Russian Federation would not forget this loss, and for every submarine NATO destroyed, a dozen more missiles would be launched from the batteries in Kaliningrad. The sea had claimed its first victims of the day, but the graveyard was far from full. The philosophical weight of the sinking settled over the bridge like the winter fog. The Baltic was once a sea of trade and shared history, but it had returned to its ancient role as a theater of ruin. As the Saxon turned to resume its patrol, the commander looked out at the black oil spreading across the waves, thinking of the men now trapped in the silent dark below. This was the tragedy of the superpower war, a collision where even the winners felt like they were losing pieces of their own humanity with every successful strike. The hunt would continue, the graveyard would grow, and the silence of the deep would eventually swallow the memory of them all. 9 in the morning. The Suwalki Gap, a 60-mile corridor of rolling farmland and dense forest that served as the only land link between the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and its besieged Baltic allies. The Polish 16th Mechanized Division, supported by a heavy battalion of American M1A2 Abrams tanks, sat in a state of grim, silent expectation as the horizon to the north and south erupted in a synchronized symphony of fire. This was the throat of the alliance, a narrow geographic vulnerability that military planners had obsessed over for decades, now transformed into a kinetic slaughterhouse where the geopolitical future of Europe would be decided. The air was a freezing, damp mist that carried the heavy, metallic smell of ionized air and the acrid, biting stench of burnt rubber from a nearby convoy that had been caught in the opening barrage. Beneath the feet of the soldiers, the earth did not merely shake. It groaned under the rhythmic, terrifying weight of 300 Russian artillery tubes firing from the Kaliningrad enclave and the Belarusian border simultaneously. The geopolitical context of the Suwalki Trap was a masterpiece of strategic entrapment, a scenario where geography itself became a weapon, used to strangle the life out of a collective defense agreement. For the Russian General Staff, closing this gap was not just a tactical objective, it was a historical imperative to reconnect the isolated fortress of Kaliningrad with the mainland of the Federation. They saw the Suwalki Corridor as an artificial barrier, a Western-imposed line on a map that denied Russia its natural strategic depth. By severing this link, the Kremlin intended to present the world with a fait accompli, a situation where the Baltic states were already lost before the first American heavy brigade could even reach the Polish border. It was a gamble based on the cold calculation that the West would lack the stomach for a protracted, bloody campaign to reopen a 60-mile stretch of dirt and pine. Tactically, the battle for the gap was a chaotic, multi-domain struggle, where the traditional lines of combat were blurred by the presence of A2AD, anti-access, and area denial bubbles. Russian Iskander-M missile systems, hidden deep within the forests of Kaliningrad, were already raining precision-guided munitions down on the Polish railheads, turning the logistical backbone of the NATO response into a twisted wreckage of iron and flame. Above the battlefield, the air was saturated with electronic warfare signals so powerful they made the soldiers' skin crawl and their radio headsets scream with a constant, agonizing static. This was a dark battlefield where GPS was a memory and the high-technology sensors of the Abrams tanks were forced to compete with the primitive, overwhelming mass of 1,000 Russian drone swarms that clouded the sky like a plague of mechanical locusts. The environment of the Suwalki Gap was a sensory nightmare of mud, iron, and the pervasive, suffocating sense of being watched from every shadow. The once quiet villages of northeastern Poland were now skeletal remains, their brick chimneys standing like tombstones. Amidst the blackened craters of 500mm rocket impacts, the sound of the wind was gone, replaced by the constant, low-frequency thrum of idling tank engines and the terrifying, high-pitched whistle of incoming grad rockets that seemed to tear the very sky apart. The soldiers lived in a world of gray on gray, where the only color was the sudden, blinding flash of an explosion or the sickly, neon green glow of a chemical warning light. They moved through the landscape like ghosts in a graveyard, knowing that the trap was not just a strategic concept, but a physical reality that was slowly closing around them. The consequences of the gap being closed were already being felt in the frantic, hushed briefings in the White House and the Élysée Palace. If the Russian forces successfully linked their northern and southern pincers, the three Baltic nations would become an island of democracy in a sea of authoritarian steel, isolated from any hope of ground reinforcement. This was the nightmare scenario of the 21st century, a return to the Iron Curtain, but one built with T-90 tanks and S-400 missile batteries instead of concrete walls. The psychological impact on the alliance was a slow-moving poison, a realization that the promise of collective security was only as strong as the 60 miles of mud they were currently fighting to hold. Inside a command tent near the Polish town of Suwalki, a brigadier general stared at a digital map that was slowly turning red, his face illuminated by the cold, flickering light of a battery-powered monitor. He knew that the logistics of the defense were failing. The fuel convoys were being hunted by Russian Spetsnaz teams in the rear, and the ammunition stocks for the Paladin self-propelled howitzers were down to 20%. This was the logistics of despair, a phase of war where the bravery of the individual was outweighed by the simple, brutal math of consumption. Every shell fired was a shell that might not be replaced, and every tank lost was a hole in the line that could never be filled. The philosophical gravity of the trap settled over the defenders as the first snow of the season began to fall, mixing with the soot and the blood to create a dark, slushy carpet over the battlefield. They were fighting for a road, a narrow strip of asphalt that represented the thin, fragile thread of Western civilization in the East. The realization that they were the generation destined to hold this line or to watch it break was a burden that aged young men by decades in a single afternoon. The Suwalki Gap was no longer just a place on Minas Estong, a map. It was a test of the human spirit against the relentless, indifferent machinery of a superpower's ambition. As the Russian pincers drew closer, the defenders prepared for a final, desperate stand in the mud, knowing that if the trap closed, the light of the Baltics might go out for a long, cold century. 10:15 in the morning. The outskirts of Tartu and the dense, snow-heavy forests of southern Estonia, the Russian BM-30 Smerch, multiple rocket launch systems, hidden beneath layers of thermal netting, began their automated firing sequences with a mechanical indifference that mocked the lives they were about to erase in the coming seconds. The Estonian sky was a bruised, heavy purple, hanging low over the rolling hills where the smell of wood smoke from abandoned farmhouses mixed with the sharp ozone tang of high-voltage electronic interference and the low-frequency hum of 1,000-horsepower engines. This was the deep battle made manifest, a tactical doctrine where the front line was no longer a single trench, but a 50-mile deep zone of total, saturating destruction intended to paralyze the enemy's spirit. Before they ever saw a single enemy soldier, the world had become a geometry of death, where the killers sat in climate-controlled cabins, staring at flickering green coordinates, while the victims were nothing more than heat signatures on a satellite uplink. 12 tubes on each launcher erupted in a synchronized, deafening roar, spewing pillars of white-hot fire that bleached the bruised sky and sent a physical shockwave, rolling through the frozen birch trees for miles in every direction. The 300mm rockets shrieked upward on columns of thick gray smoke, their flight paths calculated by cold, silicon brains that cared nothing for the history or the culture of the ancient university cities they were currently targeting. The sound was not a single explosion, but a continuous, guttural scream that seemed to tear the very fabric of the atmosphere, leaving behind a lingering chemical stench of burnt propellant and scorched earth. As the rockets reached the apex of their arc, they began their silent terminal descent, falling through the freezing mist like the iron fingers of a vengeful and indifferent god. Minutes later, the steel rain fell on the North Atlantic Treaty Organization staging areas near Tartu, each rocket releasing dozens of high-explosive submunitions that shredded the unarmored supply trucks and tore through the canvas of the field hospitals with a terrifying, rhythmic popping sound. The environment was transformed in an instant into a landscape of fire and shredded metal, where the air was a thick, suffocating soup of burnt diesel and the metallic, coppery scent of blood that turned the falling snow into a dirty, gray slush. Soldiers who had been checking their equipment or drinking cold coffee were simply erased, their physical existence snuffed out. by a rain of fragments that moved faster than the speed of sound, and left no room for prayer or last words. This was the raw, unvarnished consequence of modern firepower. A process of industrial-scale slaughter where the individual was reduced to a casualty statistic before they could even identify the direction of the threat. In response, American M142 high-mobility artillery rocket systems, operating in a shoot-and-scoot fashion from hidden clearings 20 miles to the west, fired their GPS-guided projectiles back toward the origin, signatures. The rockets left the launchers with a sharp, staccato crack, trailing thin wisps of white smoke as they climbed into the low clouds, seeking out the Russian batteries with a precision that was as surgical as it was lethal. This was the counter battery, Duel, a high-speed game of chess played with 500-pound warheads, where the losers were those who remained in their firing positions for even 60 seconds too long. The Estonian forests, once a place of silent beauty and ancient folklore, were now a chaotic theater of fire and counterfire, where the very trees were being pulverized into a fine, wooden dust by the overlapping shockwaves of 100 detonations. Above this terrestrial hell, the sky was filled with the silent, predatory presence of Orlan 10 and Switchblade drones, their unblinking cameras feeding a constant stream of targeting data back to the command centers in Moscow and Mons. The dehumanization of the conflict was now complete, as the operators of these mechanical eyes viewed the carnage on high-definition monitors, adjusting their crosshairs with the same casual detachment one might use for a video game. They watched as the rockets struck, as the fires spread, and as the tiny, pixelated figures on their screens ran for cover that no longer existed, their lives ending in a silent bloom of white on a thermal sensor. This was the paradox of the 21st century war. The more advanced the technology became, the more primitive and absolute the violence appeared to those who were forced to endure it on the ground. The civilian toll of the fire from the sky was a tragedy that defied easy description, as the historical heart of Tartu was systematically dismantled by the erratic, wide-area impact of the unguided Russian rocket salvos. The ancient stone buildings, which had survived centuries of Nordic and Teutonic wars, crumbled into heaps of gray dust and shattered glass under the relentless pressure of the high-explosive waves. Families who had sought shelter in their basements found themselves buried alive, their final moments spent in a terrifying darkness filled with the smell of ruptured gas lines and the sound of their city collapsing above them. There was no strategic objective in the destruction of these homes, only the cold, psychological calculation that a population in mourning is a population easier to conquer. A theory that had been proven wrong in every century of human history, but was still being tested with the same brutal persistence. By the time the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the artillery duel had left the landscape of southern Estonia unrecognizable, a charred and smoking wasteland where the only thing that moved was the wind whipping through the ruins. Both sides had expended thousands of rounds, and yet the front line remained largely unchanged, a testament to the futility of using massed fire as a substitute for strategic clarity. The gods of war had spoken, but their message was one of attrition and exhaustion rather than victory, leaving the survivors on both sides to wonder if there was anyone left who truly remembered what they were fighting for. The fire from the sky had burned away the illusions of a clean, high-tech conflict, leaving behind only the cold, hard reality of a war that would continue to consume everything it touched, until the land itself was nothing more than a memory of ash. 5 in the morning on the 3rd of March. The open plains 40 miles south of Tallinn. The 2nd Armored Brigade Combat Team of the United States Army was already at full sprint, their engines screaming as they launched the largest armored counteroffensive seen on the European continent since 1945. The weight of the world seemed to rest on the steel shoulders of 88 M1A2 SEP version 3 Abrams tanks, and the accompanying Polish 11th Armored Cavalry Division, a massive fist of Western technology intended to shatter the Russian pincer before the Estonian capital could be strangled into submission. The environment was a brutal, unforgiving stretch of frozen lowland, where the air was thick with the smell of wet earth. and the sharp, metallic tang of cold iron. The horizon was no longer a line, but a flickering, jagged strobe light of distant artillery, and the pale, ghostly glow of thousands of thermal-masked vehicles moving through the pre-dawn mist. This was the hammer and anvil maneuver, a high-stakes gamble that required the American and Polish forces to punch through a layered defense of mines, drones, and elite Russian Guards units that had been digging in for 72 hours. The geopolitical significance of this moment was a physical pressure that silenced the crews inside their 75-ton machines. If the counterpunch failed, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization would be forced to choose between the permanent loss of the Baltic states or an escalatory spiral that could only end in the launch of tactical nuclear weapons. There was no middle ground in the mud of Estonia. There was only the cold, binary reality of the breakthrough or the massacre. The commanders in Washington and Warsaw watched the blue icons on their satellite feeds with a collective, held breath, knowing that the liberal international order was currently being defended by 20-something-year-old tank commanders peering through digital sights at a landscape that wanted to swallow them whole. The tactics were a symphony of violence and precision. The American tanks moved in a staggered wedge, utilizing their superior fire control systems to engage the Russian T-90M defenders from over 4 kilometers away, long before the Russian optics could reliably resolve a target in the morning gloom. It was a race against the sun, as the American advantage in thermal imaging would diminish once the ground began to warm. The Polish armor, motivated by a historical fury that spanned centuries, drove with a reckless, terrifying speed on the left flank, their Leopard 2A7 tanks leaping over the frozen ridges like predatory cats. This was the 21st century version of the Charge of the Light Brigade, but executed with depleted uranium and computerized fire direction centers. The trigger was squeezed. The 120mm smoothbore gun of the lead Abrams roared with a sound that felt like the atmosphere itself had been torn in half, a white column of fire punching backward through the freezing mist. The physical shock wave was a solid wall of pressure that flattened the surrounding tall grass and sent a cloud of icy debris flying 10 meters in every direction. The heat blast washed across the sensors, carrying the sharp, chemical bite of burning propellant and the dry, scorched smell of ionized air. Inside the turret, the crew felt the massive recoil rock the 75-ton frame like a toy, followed by the mechanical, rhythmic clatter of the empty shell casing hitting the floor with a hollow, metallic ring. 2 miles away, the silver dart of the sabot round punched straight through the frontal glacis of a Russian T-90M tank, the kinetic energy converting the armor into a spray of liquid white-hot metal. The impact was not a bang, but a catastrophic, grinding scream as the round drove through the engine block and out the rear of the hull. The Russian vehicle erupted instantly, its internal fuel cells detonating in a brilliant, terrifying white flash that bleached the morning sky of all color. The 6-ton turret was severed from the hull, sent flying 10 meters into the air by the pressure of the internal explosion, before it slammed back into the frozen mud with a weight that shook the earth. Black, oily smoke began to boil out of the wreckage, a thick, greasy curtain that smelled of burnt rubber, and something far more personal. The Russian defender did not simply collapse. The formation reacted with a frantic, desperate ferocity, launching a hail of Kornet anti-tank missiles from the surrounding tree lines. The projectiles corkscrewing through the air with a high-pitched, electronic whistle that signaled a desperate, lethal intent. One missile slammed into a Polish Leopard, the blast wave throwing nearby infantry off their feet and sending a shower of burning fragments across the path of the advance. The surviving Russian tanks broke formation in a panic, their engines belching thick, artificial smoke screens. As they attempted to retreat toward the secondary line of defense, their radio channels erupting in a chaotic, overlapping scream of voices that were suddenly cut short by the next American volley. The immediate aftermath was a landscape transformed into a charnel house of fire and iron. Black smoke rose in a dozen different columns from the wrecks, still settling into the mud, the burning pieces of steel creating a flickering, hellish light that reflected off the falling snow. The silence that followed the first exchange was heavier than the noise, a dead stillness, where the only sound was the crackling of burning ammunition and the low, distant rumble of the next wave of American armor moving past the carnage. The breakthrough had been achieved. The throat of the Russian pincer had been cut, but the cost was visible in the smoldering ruins of a dozen high-technology machines and the men who had been inside them. The philosophical weight of the counterpunch settled over the victors as they continued their drive toward Tallinn. They had won the largest tank battle of the century, but the victory felt hollow in the face of the sheer scale of the destruction. This was the tragedy of modern liberation, a process where the land was saved by being turned into a graveyard of industrial waste and ash. As the Abrams tanks clattered over the blackened remains of the T-90, the crews understood that they were not just soldiers in a war, but the cleanup crew for a civilization that had finally run out of words. The road to the capital was open, but it was a road paved with the wreckage of a world that would never be the same again. 10:30 in the morning on the 6th of March. The E67 highway, the vital iron arterial stretching from the Polish border through Lithuania and Latvia toward the embattled Estonian front. The logistics of attrition were not found in the sudden, blinding flash of a tank duel, but in the slow, soul-crushing grind of the supply convoys, struggling to navigate the cratered remains of the highway under a sky that never stopped screaming with the sound of hunting drones. A single American armored division in high-intensity combat consumed more fuel and ammunition in 24 hours than a medium-sized European city used in a month. A mathematical hunger that dictated the movement of every battalion more surely than any tactical command issued from the safe, climate-controlled bunkers of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The environment of the supply route was a sensory nightmare of churned black mud, the pervasive, oily stench of spilled diesel fuel, and the constant, rhythmic thud of distant artillery that seemed to mock the efforts of the men trying to keep the machines alive. The geopolitical reality of the war had shifted from a lightning strike to a war of industrial capacity, a phase where the victory was no longer measured in miles gained, but in the ability to produce and transport more 155mm artillery shells than the enemy could destroy. For the Russian Federation, the logistics were a nightmare of aging rail networks and a desperate reliance on civilian trucks that were being systematically picked off by NATO airstrikes and special operations teams operating deep behind the lines. For the West, the challenge was the sheer distance of the tail, a 5,000-mile pipeline of steel and explosives that began in the factories of the American Midwest and ended in the shivering, mud-caked hands of a private in a foxhole near Tartu. It was a struggle of two giants, each trying to outbuild the other, while their respective economies groaned under the weight of a mobilization that had no clear end date in sight. Tactically, the logistics of despair forced commanders to make impossible choices, deciding which units would receive the limited stocks of precision-guided munitions and which would be left to face the Russian steamroller with nothing but iron sights and courage. The green line of supply was constantly being severed by Russian caliber cruise missiles and Orlan 30 drone swarms, turning every bridge and intersection into a potential graveyard of scorched aluminum and burning rubber. The American logistics officers, working 20 hours a day in mobile command centers, lived in a state of perpetual, high-stakes anxiety, knowing that a single missed convoy or a destroyed fuel depot could lead to the collapse of an entire sector of the front. They were the silent architects of the war, calculating the cost of every life in liters of fuel and pallets of medical supplies, their faces illuminated by the cold, unforgiving glow of logistical spreadsheets that showed a world slowly running out of everything. The consequences of this attrition were most visible in the medical evacuation chain, where the golden hour of trauma care had been extended into a gray eternity by the intensity of the Russian anti-air umbrella. Heavily armored MH-60 Sierra helicopters, painted with large red crosses that provided no protection against a heat-seeking missile, hovered low over the tree lines, their crews working frantically to stabilize soldiers whose bodies had been broken by the industrial violence of the front line. The smell inside the evacuation bays was a sickening, thick mixture of copper-scented blood, burnt flesh, and the sharp, antiseptic bite of emergency stimulants, a sensory record of the human cost required to keep the gears of the superpower machine turning. This was the intimate reality of the big map strategy, where the blue and red icons represented thousands of individual tragedies that would never be fully recorded or understood by the world outside the combat zone. The environment of the logistics hubs was a study in controlled chaos, where the once orderly warehouses of eastern Poland had been transformed into massive, camouflaged beehives of activity that never slept. The sound of the wind was drowned out by the constant, low-frequency rumble of heavy-lift transport planes, and the hydraulic hiss of forklifts moving mountains of crates marked with danger, high explosives, in a dozen different languages. The soldiers working these hubs were haunted by the same thousand-yard stare as the infantry, their eyes sunken and hollow from the knowledge that their failure to move a single pallet could mean the death of a friend they had trained with for years. They lived in a world of gray steel and wet concrete, where the only reminder of the spring was the freezing rain that turned the staging areas into a vast, unnavigable bog of black mire and despair. The philosophical weight of the attrition phase settled over the alliance like a cold, suffocating shroud, a realization that they were no longer fighting for a quick liberation, but for the survival of a system that was being bled dry by its own requirements. This was the dead silence between reloads, a period where the initial ideological fervor of the war had been replaced by a grim, mechanical determination to simply outlast the horror of the day. The soldiers on both sides understood, without saying it aloud, that they were being consumed by a process that was no longer under any human control. A self-sustaining cycle of destruction and replenishment that would continue until there was nothing left to replenish. The logistics of the war had become the war itself, a monster of their own making that demanded a constant sacrifice of wealth, steel, and blood to satisfy its insatiable hunger. As the sun began to set behind a thick curtain of leaden clouds, a convoy of 40 fuel trucks began its hazardous journey north, their headlights blacked out and their drivers peering through night vision goggles that turned the world into a grainy, ghostly green. They moved with a funereal slowness, knowing that at any moment the sky could erupt in a white-hot flash that would end their world in a heartbeat. They were the lifelines of a civilization, the fragile threads of glass that kept the fire of the front burning, moving through a landscape that had become a monument to the futility of the superpower struggle. The Iron Highway remained open for another night, but the price of its maintenance was a debt that would be paid by generations who had not yet been born, a legacy of ash and exhaustion. That was the only true product of the logistics of attrition. 11:30 in the morning on the 10th of March. A subterranean command center deep beneath the Ardennes forest in Belgium, and a mirrored bunker situated 300 feet below the granite of the Ural Mountains. The permissive action link, the digital heartbeat of the world's ultimate deterrent, sat in a state of agonizing, silent readiness on the consoles of men who had not seen the sun. In 14 days, the environment was a sterile, climate-controlled vacuum where the only sound was the low-frequency hum of 1,000 cooling fans, and the rhythmic, artificial chirping of satellite uplinks that monitored the movement of every mobile missile launcher from the Baltic to the Pacific. The air smelled of recycled oxygen and the sharp, metallic tang of ozone from the massive server racks that were currently calculating the acceptable loss of a tactical nuclear exchange. This was the no-win scenario, a theoretical nightmare that had been studied for decades by men in university think tanks, now transformed into a physical, suffocating reality for the commanders who held the keys to the end of history. The geopolitical context of the nuclear shadow was a direct result of the conventional stalemate that had settled over the Estonian front like a shroud of gray ash. After the American and Polish counterpunch had relieved the siege of Tallinn, the foreign military had retreated to a series of heavily fortified bastions along the border, effectively turning the eastern half of the country into an impenetrable fortress of surface-to-air missiles and long-range rocket artillery. The military forces faced a catastrophic choice. They could launch an act that would almost certainly trigger a strategic nuclear launch, or they could accept a permanent, bleeding wound on the edge of Europe. This was the escalation ladder, a vertical trap where every move toward peace required a willingness to risk the total annihilation of the human species. Tactically, the threat was no longer measured in battalions or tanks, but in the flight times of mobile ballistic missile launchers tipped with tactical warheads, currently being moved into firing positions in the forests of a coastal military enclave. The foreign military doctrine of escalate to de-escalate was being tested in the most visceral way possible, as the Defense Headquarters facility signaled its willingness to turn the strategic land corridor into a radioactive wasteland rather than concede the ground it had seized. In the opening hours of the war, above the North Sea, heavy bomber aircraft of the military forces maintained a constant, circling presence, their holds filled with air-launched cruise missiles that were the Western answer to the Russian threat. The world was a subverting in 23 taut wire, vibrating with the tension of two superpowers who had run out of conventional options and were now staring into the abyss of the ultimate endgame. The psychology of the no-win scenario was a slow-moving poison that eroded the sanity of the men in the bunkers who watched the thermal signatures of their cities on the wall-sized monitors and realized they were looking at ghosts. There was a profound, hollow sense of the absurd, the realization that 40 years of technological progress and billions of dollars in military spending had led them back to the same primitive, existential terror of the 1950s. The commanders looked into the eyes of their subordinates and saw a reflection of their own despair, a recognition that they were the participants in a game where the only winning move was to never have started. The weight of the launch codes was a physical pressure, a tightening in the chest that made every breath feel like a stolen luxury in a world that might only have minutes of life remaining. The consequences of even a limited tactical exchange were being simulated in real time. The data pouring into the command centers with a clinical, terrifying indifference to the human cost. One 10-kiloton detonation over a staging area in Poland would result in 30,000 immediate fatalities and a plume of radioactive fallout that would drift across the grain fields of Europe for 1,000 miles, poisoning the land for a century. The architecture of ruin was no longer just a metaphor for a lost war. It was the literal blueprint for the future of the continent, a landscape of glass and ash where the word victory would have no meaning. This was the terror of the nuclear threshold, the moment when the machinery of war became so powerful that it rendered the objectives of the war entirely irrelevant. In the silence of the Belgian bunker, a 4-star general stared at a red icon on his screen, representing a foreign military mobile launcher that had just entered its final firing sequence. His hand hovered over the communication line to the Defense Headquarters facility, his mind racing through a dozen different scenarios, each one ending in the same flickering white light that would bleach the sky over regional capitals simultaneously. This was the dead hand of history, a mechanism of self-destruction that had been wound up by generations of suspicion and fear, now ticking toward its final, inevitable conclusion. He realized, with a clarity that was more chilling than the cold air of the bunker, that they were no longer the masters of the machine, they were merely its final, reluctant witnesses. The philosophical gravity of the moment settled over the world like the silence before a storm, a period where the individual was reduced to a speck of dust in the path of a technological hurricane. The war in regional territory had begun as a struggle for territory and identity, but it had evolved into a struggle for the right of the world to continue existing. As the clocks on the wall ticked toward noon, the men in the bunkers waited in a state of suspended, agonizing terror, knowing that the next 60 seconds would decide whether the story of humanity would continue, or if the nuclear shadow would finally become the only reality. The machinery of the superpower, war was at its peak, the engines of destruction were at full throttle, and the only thing standing between the world and the end was the trembling hand of a man who didn't want to be the one to pull the trigger. 6 weeks into the war, the banks of the Narva River and the desolate, cratered plains of eastern Estonia, the T-90M tanks that had crossed the bridge with such mechanical arrogance 40 days prior were now nothing more than rusted, blackened husks, their shattered turrets half submerged in the freezing slush of a river that had seen 1,000 years of such madness. The environment was a study in absolute dead silence. a stillness so profound it seemed to press against the eardrums of the few survivors left in the forward trenches. The air was a heavy, stagnant shroud of cold mist, and the pervasive, cloying smell of wet ash, stagnant water, and the metallic ghost of a million spent shell casings that carpeted the earth like a layer of iron leaves. There were no birds in the sky, no wind through the skeletal trees. There was only the gray, indifferent light of a spring that refused to arrive, illuminating a landscape that had been purged of all color and hope. The geopolitical resolution of the conflict was not a treaty signed in a palace, but a ceasefire of exhaustion, born from the mutual recognition that both superpowers had reached the limit of their conventional and psychological endurance. After 42 days of high-intensity combat, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the Russian Federation found themselves locked in a jagged, bleeding stalemate that stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Ukrainian border. Neither side could claim a strategic victory. The Russian forces held a narrow, devastated strip of eastern Estonia, while the Western Alliance had successfully preserved the sovereignty of Tallinn at the cost of its military readiness and its internal cohesion. This was the Grey Peace, a state of non-war that felt more like a slow-motion funeral for the international order that had existed before the 24th of February. The consequences of the campaign were written in numbers that the human mind struggled to process, all transcribed in the cold, clinical language of post-war analysis. 128,000 personnel on both sides were estimated to have been killed or wounded. A demographic catastrophe that had erased an entire generation of young men and women in less than 2 months. 3,400 tanks and 600 combat aircraft had been reduced to scrap metal, representing a loss of industrial wealth that would take decades to replenish. In Estonia, 75% of the national infrastructure, the power grids, the digital networks, the ancient stone cities had been pulverized into a fine, gray dust by the relentless application of long-range rocket artillery and precision-guided munitions. Tactically, the war had proven that the era of the quick victory was a dangerous myth, a delusion that had nearly led the world to a nuclear apocalypse. The Estonian Shield had held just long enough for the American counterpunch to land, but the resulting collision had not been a decisive breakthrough. It had been a grinding, attritional struggle where the only real winner was the machinery of destruction itself. The Suwalki Gap remained a contested, militarized zone, a permanent scar on the map of Europe that required the constant presence of 100,000 NATO troops to prevent the trap from closing again. The ladder of escalation had been climbed to its final, terrifying rung. And though the world had flinched before the final step, the shadow of the mushroom cloud now hung permanently over every diplomatic negotiation. The psychology of the survivors was a landscape of trauma and hollowed-out stares as the men who had operated the F-35 fighters and the Abrams tanks returned to a world that no longer made sense to them. They had seen the architecture of ruin firsthand, and they understood, with a clarity that the politicians in Washington and Moscow could never share, that the war had settled nothing. They lived in the dead silence between reloads, a period of haunted vigilance where every sudden noise sounded like the whistle of an incoming Iskander-M, and every sunrise felt like a temporary reprieve. The bond of the tripwire had been replaced by a bond of shared exhaustion, a recognition among the combatants that they were all victims of a historical mechanism that they had no power to stop. The philosophical weight of the war settled over the continent like the winter fog that refused to lift from the Narva River. This was not a peace, it was merely the cessation of kinetic energy, a pause in the violence that allowed the gravediggers to do their work, and the engineers to begin the impossible task of rebuilding. The world had looked into the abyss and seen its own reflection, a primitive, violent face hidden behind a mask of high-technology sophistication. The realization that civilization was only 60 miles of mud away from total collapse was a burden that would change the soul of the West forever, turning the optimism of the early 21st century into a grim, defensive posture of permanent readiness. As the first thin, watery sunbeams of April finally broke through the clouds, reflecting off the jagged, gray wings of a lone drone patrolling the line of contact. At latitude 59 degrees 22 minutes north, the silence of the Baltics remained unbroken. There was no triumphalist music, no parades in the streets of the liberated cities, only the quiet, rhythmic sound of shovels hitting frozen earth, and the low, distant rumble of a world trying to remember how to breathe without the smell of smoke. The war had ended, not with a bang or a whimper, but with a cold, hollow stare into the dark. The Iron Crossing was over, but the crossing of the human spirit back to a state of normalcy would take a century that the world no longer felt it had the time to give.